Keep it, my aunt said as she slipped a $20 bill into my hand. You probably need it more than we do. The room erupted in soft laughter. Not the kind that comes from joy, but the kind that comes from people who believe they are better than someone else. I stood there for a moment, feeling every eye in the room settle on me. Then I smiled, folded the bill carefully, and slipped it into my purse. 3 months later, those same people would be asking me for help. My name is Emily Carter, and at 22 years old, I knew what it felt like to walk into a room where nobody expected anything from you except embarrassment. The Whitmore family gathering was being held at a sprawling lakefront estate just outside of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. White tents covered the lawn. Strings of warm lights hung from ancient oak trees. Luxury cars lined the driveway like a private showroom. Everything about the place seemed designed to remind visitors that the Whitmores had money, influence, and status. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing the only formal dress I owned. It was navy blue, simple, and nearly 4 years old. I had saved for months to buy it when I graduated from community college. As I stepped onto the stone patio, I immediately noticed the subtle glances. The women examined my shoes. The men looked past me as if searching for someone more important. A few younger relatives whispered behind their wine glasses. I pretended not to notice. I had learned long ago that dignity often meant staying silent when others expected you to react. Ethan Whitmore greeted me warmly near the entrance. He was one of the few people in that family who treated me like a human being instead of a charity project. "Emily, you made it," he said with a smile. "Glad you're here." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied. Before we could continue talking, his cousin Madison appeared beside us. Her designer dress probably cost more than my monthly rent. She looked me up and down and smiled politely, though her eyes held something colder. "How sweet," she said. "It's nice that Ethan invites everyone." Ethan frowned slightly, but Madison had already turned away. I spent the next hour moving through conversations that felt more like interviews. People asked where I worked, where I lived, and what kind of car I drove. Each answer seemed to disappoint them. When I explained that I worked long shifts at a neighborhood diner while helping care for my mother, their expressions shifted into that familiar mixture of pity and superiority. Then came the moment that everyone remembered. During dinner, a discussion began about investment properties and vacation homes. I quietly listened while relatives compared beachfront houses in Florida and ski trips in Colorado. Finally, someone asked me where I liked to vacation. Before I could answer, my Aunt Linda laughed. "Vacation," she said. "Emily probably considers a day off a luxury." More laughter followed. Then she pulled a $20 bill from her purse and held it toward me. "Here, maybe this will help." The table chuckled. A few people looked uncomfortable, but nobody stopped her. Nobody spoke up. I accepted the bill, smiled politely, and thanked her. That seemed to confuse them more than anger would have. The conversation moved on, but something had changed inside me. Not because I was hurt. I was used to being underestimated. What struck me was how certain they all were. They believed wealth measured worth. They believed struggle meant weakness. They believed they understood exactly who I was. As the evening continued, I looked around the glowing dining room and watched the Whitmore family celebrate their success. They looked untouchable. They looked secure. They looked like people who thought tomorrow would be exactly like today. None of them knew that cracks had already begun forming beneath the surface of everything they had built. And none of them knew that when those cracks finally widened, the last person they would expect to save them would be the poor girl they laughed at over dinner. When I got home that night, I placed the folded $20 bill on the kitchen counter beside a stack of unpaid medical invoices. The contrast would have been funny if it had not been so familiar. My apartment was small, barely 700 square feet, with aging hardwood floors and a refrigerator that hummed loudly whenever it started a cooling cycle. It was nothing like the Whitmore estate, but it was home. More importantly, it was where my mother and I had built a life out of persistence rather than privilege. She was sitting in her favorite chair when I walked in, a blanket draped across her knees and a paperback novel resting in her lap. The lamp beside her cast a warm glow across the room. "How was the party?" she asked. I smiled as I hung my coat near the door. "About what I expected." She studied my face for a moment. My mother had always possessed an uncanny ability to notice things I tried to hide. "Rough evening?" she asked gently. I shrugged and moved toward the kitchen. "Nothing I have not seen before." She did not push further. She never did. "Growing up?" She taught me that dignity was often found in what people chose not to say. The next morning began the way most mornings did. My alarm sounded at 5:30. By 6:15, I was already driving toward the diner where I worked. The winter sky was still dark, and frost covered the edges of parked cars. Inside the restaurant, the scent of coffee and fresh biscuits filled the air. The breakfast crowd arrived early. Construction workers, teachers, retirees, and office employees all moved through the doors in steady waves. For the next 10 hours, I carried trays, refilled coffee cups, and smiled through exhaustion. Most customers were kind. A few were impatient. That was life. During my lunch break, I reviewed notes inside a worn notebook I carried everywhere. To anyone else, it probably looked ordinary. In reality, it contained pages of financial analysis, business case studies, market research, and strategic planning exercises. While others spent evenings watching television, I spent mine studying. Learning had always been my way forward. A scholarship had once opened doors for me, but circumstances had forced me to step away from opportunities many people assumed I never had. I never talked about it because explanations rarely changed opinions. People preferred simple stories. Poor girl. Struggling waitress. Unimportant. Those labels made them comfortable. 3 days after the Whitmore gathering, I stopped by a pharmacy to pick up my mother's prescription. The total came to $183. I stood quietly at the register, calculating bills in my head. Rent, utilities, groceries, gasoline, medication. Every dollar already had a destination before it reached my bank account. As I walked back to my car, my phone vibrated. It was Ethan. "Hey," he said when I answered. I wanted to apologize for some of my relatives. I leaned against the car door and looked across the parking lot. "You do not owe me an apology." "Maybe not," he replied, "but I am giving one anyway." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then his voice became more serious. "Something strange is happening at the company." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Probably nothing," he said quickly. "Just some issues with a few accounts. Delayed reports. Missed projections. My father says everything is under control." I remembered the confidence I had seen around that dinner table. The certainty. The assumption that success was permanent. "And you believe him?" I asked. Ethan hesitated. "I am not sure anymore." After the call ended, I sat quietly behind the steering wheel. A cold wind rattled against the windows. Somewhere across Wisconsin, the Whitmore family was continuing life as usual. Business meetings, charity events, expensive dinners. They still believed they were standing on solid ground. What they could not see yet was that the foundation beneath them was already beginning to shift. The following week moved with the steady rhythm of ordinary life, but small details kept pulling at the edge of my attention. Every few days, Ethan would send a short message. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just brief observations that seemed insignificant on their own. A supplier delaying shipments, a major client postponing a contract renewal, a department manager resigning unexpectedly after nearly 15 years with the company. Individually, each issue could be explained away. Together, they began forming a pattern. One rainy Thursday evening, I was finishing my shift at the diner when I noticed Ethan sitting alone in a booth near the back window. He looked different from the confident man I had met at the lake house gathering. His tie was loosened. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. A half-finished cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him. I slid into the seat across from him during my break. "Long day?" I asked. He laughed quietly. "Long month." Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. The diner was nearly empty between lunch and dinner rushes. For a moment, he simply stared at the parking lot. "Do you ever get the feeling that everyone else can see something you cannot?" he finally asked. "Sometimes," I said. "Usually when I am missing an important piece of information." He nodded slowly. "That is exactly how this feels." Ethan explained that internal reports no longer match projections. Revenue numbers looked strong on paper, yet cash flow was tightening. Expenses were climbing without clear explanations. Several executives kept insisting everything was normal. The more they reassured him, the less convinced he became. "My father says I am worrying too much," he said. "My uncle says markets go through cycles. Everyone keeps giving me reasons not to ask questions." I stirred my coffee thoughtfully. "And what happens when people become uncomfortable with questions?" "Usually they stop asking them," he replied. "Or they are encouraged to." For the first time, I saw genuine concern behind his eyes. Not fear, not panic. Concern. The kind that appears when someone senses a storm before the clouds arrive. Later that night, after helping my mother organize her medications for the week, I sat at the kitchen table reviewing industry reports on my laptop. Public information told its own story if you knew where to look. Whitmore Enterprises had expanded aggressively during the previous 2 years. New acquisitions, new facilities, new debt obligations. Growth looked impressive from a distance. Up close, it appeared fragile. I closed the laptop and stared at the reflection in the dark window above the sink. Wealth often created an illusion of safety. People saw large houses, luxury vehicles, and impressive titles. They assumed success was permanent. They rarely noticed how quickly everything could change when decisions were built on confidence instead of caution. The following Sunday, another Whitmore family event filled the estate with guests. I attended only because Ethan personally invited me. The atmosphere seemed identical to the previous gathering. Laughter echoed across the lawn. Expensive watches flashed beneath the afternoon sun. Conversations revolved around investments, vacations, and future expansions. Yet beneath the polished surface, subtle tensions had appeared. I noticed worried expressions exchanged between executives. I overheard fragments of conversations that stopped whenever someone approached. Several family members checked their phones repeatedly. Even those who pretended everything was perfect seemed distracted. During dinner, Madison confidently announced that Whitmore Enterprises was preparing for its strongest year ever. The table responded with approving smiles. I glanced toward Ethan. He remained silent. Across the room, his father Richard Whitmore raised a glass and spoke about growth, opportunity, and unlimited potential. Everyone applauded. But as I watched him speak, I noticed something unexpected. For a brief moment, his confident smile disappeared. It lasted less than a second. Most people never would have seen it. I did, because I had spent years learning to recognize the difference between confidence and performance. And for the first time, I realized the Whitmore family was no longer celebrating success. They were trying very hard to convince themselves it still existed. Over the next 2 weeks, the atmosphere around Whitmore Enterprises changed in ways that became impossible to ignore. News did not arrive all at once. It rarely did. Problems appeared quietly, one after another, like small leaks inside a ship that everyone assumed was unsinkable. Ethan called me more frequently now. Sometimes he wanted advice. Sometimes he simply wanted someone willing to listen without pretending everything was fine. One evening, after I finished my shift at the diner, he asked if we could meet at a small coffee shop near downtown Milwaukee. When I arrived, several folders were spread across the table in front of him. He looked exhausted. Not physically, mentally, like someone carrying questions nobody around him wanted answered. I finally got access to some of the internal reports, he said. And I asked. He slid a document toward me. Nothing matches. I spent several minutes reviewing the numbers. Revenue projections had been inflated. Operating costs were significantly higher than public statements suggested. Several acquisitions that had been celebrated as major successes were producing losses. The deeper I looked, the more troubling the picture became. How many people know this? I asked quietly. Ethan rubbed his forehead. A few executives. My father. My uncle. Maybe some board members. And what are they doing about it? He laughed bitterly, mostly pretending it will fix itself. Outside, traffic moved steadily through the wet evening streets. Inside the coffee shop, soft music played overhead. The ordinary world continued as if nothing unusual was happening. Yet somewhere behind conference room doors and executive offices, a crisis was growing larger every day. A few days later, the first public signs appeared. Industry publications reported unexpected delays in several Whitmore development projects. Analysts began asking questions during earnings discussions. Investors who once praised the company started expressing concern. At the Whitmore estate, however, appearances remained everything. Another family gathering was organized, this time to celebrate a new commercial project that had not even been completed yet. Expensive decorations filled the ballroom. Caterers moved through the crowd carrying trays of appetizers. A jazz band performed near the entrance. To an outsider, it looked like success. To me, it looked like denial. During the event, I noticed something else. The relatives who once spent their evenings boasting about profits and expansion had become strangely defensive. Conversations ended abruptly when finances were mentioned. Smiles appeared forced. Laughter arrived half a second too late. Even Madison seemed distracted. While speaking with a group of guests, she checked her phone repeatedly and frowned each time she read a new message. Near the end of the evening, I stepped outside onto a balcony overlooking the lake. The water reflected the glow of hundreds of lights from the estate. Ethan joined me a few minutes later. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence felt heavier than usual. Finally, he exhaled slowly. The bank requested additional documentation this morning. I turned toward him. That is not a good sign. No, he admitted. It is not. He stared across the dark water. You know what scares me most? What? Everyone keeps acting like we still have unlimited time. His words stayed with me long after I returned home that night. Because he was right. The greatest danger was not the financial problems. It was the belief that those problems could be ignored. In the following days, reports continued surfacing. Suppliers demanded faster payments. Partners postponed agreements. Investors requested meetings. The cracks were widening. Yet many members of the Whitmore family remained focused on preserving appearances. They still believed reputation alone could protect them. They still believed success from the past guaranteed security in the future. What they did not realize was that the situation had already moved beyond pride, beyond image, and beyond wishful thinking. A turning point was approaching. And when it arrived, the people who had spent years judging others by their bank accounts were about to learn how quickly fortunes could change. The turning point arrived on a Tuesday morning. I was pouring coffee for a regular customer when my phone began vibrating repeatedly inside my apron pocket. During a quiet moment, I stepped into the hallway near the storage room and checked the screen. 5 missed calls from Ethan. 2 messages. The first simply read, "Call me." The second was shorter. "It is happening." My stomach tightened. When my shift ended, I called him immediately. He answered before the first ring finished. The exhaustion in his voice had been replaced by something else. Urgency. "The bank suspended negotiations," he said. "Several investors pulled out this morning. The board has called an emergency meeting." I sat down on a bench outside the diner and listened. Cars moved through the parking lot. People carried groceries. The world looked completely normal. Yet somewhere inside corporate offices across the state, panic was beginning to spread. Over the next 48 hours, the situation deteriorated quickly. Industry publications released reports questioning the stability of Whitmore Enterprises. Local business news stations covered the story. Analysts who had once praised the company suddenly changed their tone. Employees started worrying about their jobs. Vendors demanded assurances. Clients delayed commitments. Confidence, which had taken decades to build, began disappearing in a matter of days. Ethan later told me that the atmosphere inside company headquarters felt unrecognizable. Hallways that were usually filled with confident conversations had become unusually quiet. Executives spent hours behind closed doors. Emergency meetings replaced long-term planning sessions. Nobody seemed willing to admit how serious the problem had become, yet everyone could feel it. A week later, another gathering took place at the Whitmore estate. This time there was no celebration, no live music, no speeches about growth. Family members arrived carrying stress instead of confidence. I attended only because Ethan insisted. As I walked through the front entrance, I immediately noticed the difference. The same people who once laughed the loudest now seemed distracted. The same relatives who proudly discussed investments now spoke in hushed voices. Even Madison looked exhausted. For the first time since I had met her, she seemed more worried than judgmental. During dinner, nobody talked about vacation homes or expansion projects. Conversations centered on uncertainty. Questions filled the room. Answers did not. Richard Whitmore sat near the head of the table, looking older than I remembered. The confident executive who once controlled every conversation now appeared weighed down by responsibilities he could no longer manage alone. At one point, I overheard fragments of a discussion between several senior family members. They were debating whether to sell assets, reduce operations, or seek outside assistance. Every option sounded expensive. Every solution seemed temporary. The deeper problem remained untouched. I listened quietly while finishing my meal. Nobody paid much attention to me. They rarely did. Old habits are difficult to break. People tend to see what they expect to see. To them, I was still the young woman who worked long shifts at a diner and lived in a modest apartment. They did not know about the years I spent studying business strategy after midnight. They did not know about the financial models stored on my laptop. They did not know how many nights I had spent analyzing companies much larger than theirs. Near the end of the evening, Ethan approached me privately. His expression was serious. "I do not think we have much time left," he said quietly. I looked toward the dining room, where worried conversations continued around the table. For months, the Whitmore family had ignored warning signs. Now those warnings had become reality. "Then someone needs to start asking the right questions," I replied. Ethan nodded slowly. "The problem is that nobody seems to know what those questions are anymore." As we stood there, I realized the crisis had finally reached a point where pride could no longer hide it. The empire everyone believed was untouchable was beginning to crumble. And for the first time, whether they realized it or not, they were approaching the moment when they would need help from the one person they had spent years underestimating. 3 days after that gathering, Ethan arrived at my apartment without warning. I had just returned from work and was carrying a bag of groceries when I saw his car parked along the curb. The moment I stepped out of my vehicle, I knew something had changed. He was sitting behind the wheel, staring straight ahead, instead of checking his phone like he normally did. When he noticed me, he stepped out and forced a smile that lasted only a second. "How bad is it?" I asked before he could speak. Ethan let out a long breath. "Worse than anyone thought." We carried the groceries upstairs and sat at the small kitchen table while my mother rested in the living room with her headphones on. The apartment felt unusually quiet. Ethan placed a thick folder on the table and pushed it toward me. "I should not even have this," he admitted, "but I do not know who else to trust." I opened the folder slowly. Inside were reports, projections, internal memos, and financial summaries. The deeper I read, the more concerned I became. The company was not facing one problem. It was facing several at the same time. Debt obligations were approaching critical deadlines. Multiple projects were consuming cash without producing meaningful returns. Departments were operating with overlapping expenses. Most alarming of all, leadership had spent months hiding weaknesses behind optimistic forecasts. They had been protecting appearances instead of solving problems. Ethan watched my expression carefully. "You see it too, do not you?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes." He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "Everyone keeps hiring consultants. Every week there is another expert, another presentation, another expensive plan, and none of them are helping. Most of them tell the board exactly what the board wants to hear." That answer did not surprise me. During difficult times, people often pay for reassurance when what they really need is honesty. I spent the next hour reviewing documents. Numbers rarely lied. People did. By the time I finished, a rough picture had already formed in my mind. The company was not doomed. Not yet. But it was moving in the wrong direction with alarming speed. Several difficult decisions needed to be made immediately. Delaying them would only increase the damage. Ethan noticed the notebook beside my laptop. "You have been taking notes." "I always take notes." He smiled faintly. "About us." I looked down at the pages. Months of observations filled them. Public reports, market trends, industry comparisons, financial concerns. Sometimes, I admitted. His expression shifted from curiosity to surprise. "Emily, how much do you actually know about this?" For a moment I hesitated. Very few people knew the full story. Most assumed I had simply worked service jobs my entire adult life. It was easier that way. Expectations remained low. Questions remained limited. "More than people think," I replied quietly. Ethan laughed for the first time all evening. "That is becoming increasingly obvious." 2 days later, news broke that another major investor had withdrawn support. The story spread quickly across business networks. Employees became anxious. Shareholders demanded answers. Emergency meetings multiplied. Inside the Whitmore family, tensions that had remained hidden for years finally began surfacing. Relatives blamed one another. Executives defended past decisions. Nobody seemed willing to accept responsibility. Yet despite all the arguments, nobody had a solution. Late one evening, Ethan called again. His voice sounded tired but determined. "The board is meeting this weekend," he said. "Everyone will be there." I stood by my apartment window looking out at the city lights. And there was a brief pause. "And I think they need to hear something they have not heard before." I understood immediately. For the first time since the crisis began, someone inside the Whitmore family was no longer searching for excuses. They were searching for answers. And whether the family realized it or not, the moment was approaching when the young woman they had dismissed as insignificant would finally have a chance to speak. The board meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning at the Whitmore headquarters. Ethan arrived at my apartment just after 7 o'clock to pick me up. During the drive, neither of us spoke much. The sky was gray, and a steady rain tapped against the windshield. As we approached the glass office tower that housed Whitmore Enterprises, I could feel the weight of what was about to happen. This was not my world, at least not according to the people waiting inside. To them, I was still the young woman who served coffee and worked long shifts to support her family. They had no reason to expect anything from me. In a strange way, that worked to my advantage. The conference room occupied the top floor of the building. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. A long polished table stretched through the center of the room. Around it sat executives, board members, attorneys, and family shareholders. Some looked worried. Others looked irritated. A few looked exhausted. Richard Whitmore sat near the head of the table. His expression hardened slightly when he noticed me entering alongside Ethan. Madison was there as well. The moment her eyes landed on me, confusion flashed across her face. Nobody asked why I had come, at least not immediately. The meeting began with reports, projections, and updates. One executive blamed market conditions. Another blamed interest rates. A consultant delivered a presentation filled with charts and complicated language that somehow managed to explain very little. For nearly 2 hours, the discussion continued in circles. Every problem was identified. Every concern was repeated. Yet no solution emerged. Eventually, Richard leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. The room fell silent. "Does anyone have anything useful to add?" he asked. Nobody spoke. Several people avoided eye contact. Others shuffled papers across the table. Then Ethan cleared his throat. Every head turned toward him. "Actually," he said calmly, "I know someone who does." The silence that followed felt even heavier than before. Ethan looked directly at me. "Emily." A few eyebrows immediately lifted. Madison stared at him as though he had lost his mind. One board member actually laughed under his breath. Richard frowned. "You cannot be serious." Ethan never looked away from me. "I am completely serious." My heart was beating faster than usual, but my voice remained steady when I finally spoke. "May I ask a question?" Richard crossed his arms. "Go ahead." I opened one of the financial reports sitting on the table. "Why are you continuing to finance underperforming projects that have failed to meet targets for 6 consecutive quarters?" The room became very quiet. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. I asked another question, then another. Each one focused on specific numbers, specific decisions, and specific patterns hidden within the reports. Within minutes, the atmosphere changed. People stopped looking at me with amusement. They started looking at me with attention. One executive attempted to dismiss my concerns. I calmly cited figures from his own department's reports. Another tried to shift responsibility. The documents told a different story. For nearly an hour, I continued asking questions nobody else had asked. By the time I finished, the room no longer viewed the crisis as a collection of unrelated problems. They finally saw it for what it was. A series of strategic mistakes that could still be corrected if action was taken immediately. Richard remained silent for a long time. Eventually, he leaned forward. "Where exactly did you learn all this?" he asked. I thought about the countless nights spent studying after work. The textbooks, the research, the sacrifices, the opportunities one never talked about. "I paid attention," I replied. For the first time since I had met the Whitmore family, nobody laughed. Nobody smirked. Nobody looked away. They simply listened. And in that moment, the young woman they once dismissed had become the only person in the room offering a path forward. The Monday after the board meeting felt different. Not because the crisis had disappeared. It had not. If anything, the challenges ahead looked even larger now that everyone finally understood their true scale. The difference was that for the first time, there was a plan. Instead of arguing about who was responsible, people were discussing what needed to happen next. Instead of protecting their reputations, they were beginning to focus on protecting the company itself. Over the following weeks, I spent countless hours reviewing reports, attending meetings, and helping Ethan organize priorities. The first recommendation was simple but difficult. Stop pretending. Several projects that had consumed enormous amounts of money without producing meaningful returns needed to be paused immediately. Certain expansion plans had to be delayed. Expenses had to be examined line by line. Nobody enjoyed hearing those recommendations. Yet every time the numbers were reviewed, the same conclusion appeared. Reality did not care about pride. Reality only responded to decisions. At first, some executives resisted. They had spent years defending strategies that were now being questioned. A few board members openly doubted me. One even asked whether a waitress should really be advising a company of this size. I remember the silence that followed. Months earlier, a comment like that might have embarrassed me. Now it barely registered. The reports answered better than I ever could. Ethan simply handed the board member a folder containing projections. 10 minutes later, the discussion moved on. Gradually, something unexpected happened. The recommendations started working. A costly division that had been draining resources was restructured. Several unnecessary contracts were renegotiated. Operating expenses declined. Cash flow improved. None of it was dramatic enough for headlines. But inside the company, people noticed. Employees who had feared layoffs began seeing signs of stability. Investors who had stopped returning calls slowly became willing to listen again. Confidence did not return all at once. It arrived one small victory at a time. During one particularly long afternoon, I found myself standing in the headquarters cafeteria with Ethan. Large windows overlooked the city below. Employees moved through the room, carrying lunches and coffee cups. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had just a few weeks earlier. "You know," Ethan said, staring out the window, "when all of this started, I thought we needed someone extraordinary to save us." I smiled slightly. And turns out we just needed someone willing to tell the truth. His words stayed with me. Because the truth was never complicated. The warning signs had always been there. People simply chose not to see them. As the months passed, positive reports began replacing negative ones. Financial publications that had questioned the company's future started writing about its recovery efforts. Analysts who once predicted failure revised their forecasts. The board approved a long-term restructuring strategy based largely on the framework we had developed. Even Richard Whitmore changed. He still carried the presence of a successful executive, but some of the arrogance had disappeared. In its place was something far more valuable: humility. One evening, after a quarterly review meeting, Richard approached me in the nearly empty conference room. The city lights reflected against the glass walls around us. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking at the document spread. Across the table, "I spent years believing experience guaranteed wisdom," he finally said. "Now I realize experience only matters if you keep learning." It was not quite an apology. Richard Whitmore was not the type of man who apologized easily. Yet it was the closest thing to one I had ever heard from him. And as I looked around the room, I realized something remarkable had happened. The people who once dismissed my voice were now building their future around it. 6 months after that board meeting, the Whitmore estate hosted another family gathering. The same lake reflected the evening sunlight. The same stone pathways wound through the gardens. The same relatives arrived in expensive cars and carefully chosen outfits. Yet everything felt different. As I stepped onto the property, I found myself remembering the first time I had stood there. I remembered the sideways glances, the quiet laughter, the $20 bill folded into my hand as though kindness and humiliation were the same thing. Back then, nobody expected me to matter. Now, as guests moved through the estate, many of those same people stopped to greet me. Some asked for my opinion. Others thanked me for things they once assumed happened without effort. Success had not changed who I was. It had simply changed what people were willing to see. During dinner, I noticed that the seating arrangement looked very different from previous gatherings. This time, a place had been reserved for me near the center of the table. Richard Whitmore personally welcomed guests as they arrived. When he reached my chair, he paused for a moment. "I am glad you are here, Emily," he said. The statement was simple, but it carried more meaning than most people realized. Across the table, Madison offered a polite smile. Months earlier, that smile would have been forced. Now it seemed genuine. Life has a way of teaching lessons that pride refuses to learn voluntarily. As conversations continued around the room, Ethan stood and tapped his glass gently. The room gradually fell silent. "Before dinner," he said, "there is something I would like to say." Everyone turned toward him. He looked around the table before continuing. "The last year has been the most difficult period our family and company have ever faced. We made mistakes. Some of them were expensive. Some of them were embarrassing. But we were fortunate enough to receive help when we needed it most." His eyes settled on me. And that help came from someone many of us failed to appreciate. The room remained quiet. Nobody looked away. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Ethan raised his glass slightly. To Emily. One by one, others followed. For a moment, I did not know what to say. Then I noticed Aunt Linda sitting a few seats away. The same woman who had once handed me $20 in front of an entire room. She slowly reached into her purse and pulled out something folded. The sight almost made me laugh. When she walked over and placed it in front of me, I recognized it immediately. A $20 bill. I believe this belongs to you, she said softly. Several people smiled. A few looked embarrassed. Aunt Linda shook her head. For what it is worth, I was wrong. There was no dramatic apology. No tears. No grand speech. Just honesty. Somehow, that made it more meaningful. I picked up the bill and folded it carefully before slipping it into my purse. Not because I needed the money, because I wanted the reminder. Later that evening, after dinner ended and guests drifted outside to enjoy the warm summer air, I stood alone near the lake. The water moved gently beneath the fading sunlight. Ethan joined me after a few minutes. Quite a difference from the first party, he said. I smiled. A little. He laughed. You could have made them feel foolish. Maybe. Why did you not? I looked across the water. Because proving people wrong is not nearly as important as proving yourself right. The breeze carried the scent of fresh grass across the shoreline. Behind us, voices and laughter drifted from the estate. For the first time, they sounded different. Not because the family had become perfect. No family ever does. But because they had finally learned something valuable. Wealth can disappear. Status can change. Circumstances can shift overnight. Character is what remains. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the very person carrying the future in their hands.